Well, it's got a view, a great location, and quite a story behind it. We're talking about Bernie Madoff's $7 million beachfront home in Montauk, New York. The U.S. Marshals Service, which shot this video, is looking for brokers to sell the place. They're going to be selling into one of the toughest housing markets ever in the Hamptons, New York's playground for the rich and famous. We're joined right now by Jonathan Miller. He's president of real estate appraisal firm Miller Samuel. Always glad to have you on with us, Jonathan.
Great to be here.
So let's just talk about activity in general. What are you seeing right now as far as Manhattan real estate prices go and the Hamptons real estate prices?
Well, there's tremendous linkage between both markets because Wall Street is sort of the common denominator. And what's been interesting, since June, there's been a real uptick in contract activity. In fact, the level of sales right now are at the same level they were a year ago, which is quite different than we saw last spring.
Do you think it's a positive trend that's here to stay, or is it more flash in the pan?
Well, I think it's a release of the pent-up demand from the dearth of activity that we had at the end of last year and the beginning of this year. I wouldn't say that it means that we're at a bottom, but it's relatively positive, sure.
Well, we're showing a lot of video, as you just saw on your screens there, of the Madoff mansion. From what we understand, it's in the $7 to $10 million price range. Does that sound about accurate? You know the market. I know you can't talk about pricing, but does that seem about right from what you know of the property?
I've talked to a lot of real estate brokers in the market, and that seems to be their comfort level.
How are homes in that price range selling right now versus others?
There's actually been that represents about the top 2% of all the sales. So you're really looking at in the second quarter there were 3 sales at 10 million and above. It's not a lot of activity, but it's certainly they certainly do sell.
And I mean, the U.S. Marshals find themselves in probably an unusual role for them,
yes,
in that they have to pick a broker who they think is going to give them the best price. I mean, their goal, right, is to get as much money as they can from this house.
Right. They're trying to recoup money for the investors that lost their shirt, so to speak.
Now, we know one sort of peculiar thing about this house is it's in this very healthy price range, but it's on a public beach. However, word is it's in a pretty low-key spot, so that should be something that recommends it.
Oh, I think it's a very good location. It's actually, if you built the home today, you might not be able to situate it so close to the beach. It is a public beach, but there's not a lot of people walking by. Although with this situation, maybe that'll change temporarily.
Well, that sort of brings up an interesting point about the celebrity factor, whether it's notorious in the case of Madoff or, you know, other houses that maybe have more positive associations for the people who have lived in them. What does that do usually to the interest in a house? I'm assuming it cultivates it, and to the price of a house.
Well, you have to look at it in terms of marketing exposure. How many eyeballs are seeing this property? So it's getting a tremendous amount of exposure. However, sort of the age of conspicuous consumption has been put on hold with the problems that we're having now. So it's a mixed bag. I think the takeaway is going to be very positive. What
other big stories? I mean, we've heard about some pretty big Wall Street names. I mean, Blackstone Group, Steven Schwartzman, just one of the names coming to mind, you know, basically selling his home in the Hamptons for over $7 million. I mean, there's a lot of
well, that's the characterization of the market, is that inventory is very elevated. So in order to sell a property when you have a lot more competition, you have to get more exposure. And this certainly is getting a lot of exposure, or will get a lot of exposure.
As you look ahead to the rest of the year, this is obviously a quieting down period, I'm assuming, for beach houses. What is a successful quarter, do you think, a successful fourth quarter for the real estate market out there?
Well, the fourth quarter is going to be the weakest quarter of every year for the most part in terms of the level of activity.
And that's the way it's always been.
It's very cyclical. You have a very high concentration of activity in the first half of the year after the bonuses and people coming out after the winter to start looking at property. So I think we're really not going to see much of a real resurgence in the market until after the first of the year.
And are you hearing just anecdotally people saying, you know, hey, I didn't get my bonus, so I can't look this year, but maybe I'll contact you next year?
You are seeing people want to buy. You have to remember that prices in the Hamptons since the beginning of 2007 have fallen about 25%. So that brings a whole new wave of people that can qualify. The problem is that credit is still very tight, and that is keeping the level of activity reined in.
All right, Jonathan, always good to see you. Thanks for stopping in.
My pleasure.
Jonathan Miller, president of Miller Samuel.